Final Fantasy is somewhat of an interesting franchise to me. I never really played any of the games growing up, and I don't really have any nostalgia for them either, but I ended up hopelessly addicted to Final Fantasy XIV over the course of the year. Having played so much of 14, my curiosity about the rest of the franchise began to develop. I ended up playing Final Fantasy X due to its high praise and common recommendation to a series newcomer. As someone who avoided random encounter, turn-based combat RPGs, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed the game and wondered if I could stomach some of the older titles. Then I found out about the newly released Pixel remasters and decided to pick up Final Fantasy I on the summer sale. So, how's Final Fantasy I in 2022? Going into this game, my expectations were honestly set at rock bottom. After all, this game is the first in one of the longest running video game franchises in history. I was worried about endless grinding, I expected ancient and artificial NES difficulty design, and I was not looking forward to the constant random encounters. After playing through the game and earning every Steam achievement, I'm actually relieved to say that the Pixel remaster makes the first Final Fantasy a very manageable and at times even enjoyable experience. Firstly, I want to talk about story. The story of Final Fantasy I is interesting in a sense to me because of the expectations I came in with. To me, story has always been at the forefront of Final Fantasy games. Even Final Fantasy XIV, an MMO that I got solely into for the purpose of endgame content and raiding, has a story that got me completely hooked and blew my mind. That's why, even for how old this game is, I was somewhat surprised to see how bare bones the story was. 4 mysterious warriors of light appear and they must track down the 4 elemental crystals to save the world from the evil Chaos who's ravaging people or whatever. It's definitely not the worst story I've ever seen, but it's absolutely a very early NES game. Upon completing Final Fantasy I, I've begun playing Final Fantasy II, which is narratively a lot more what I expected from a Final Fantasy game. The narrative is in the forefront, it's in the spotlight, and it's really the focus of what's going on in the world around you. But this video is about Final Fantasy I, and I hope to talk about Final Fantasy II in the future when I've completed that game. Anyways, we gotta go collect the 4 magical crystals, and that's a good enough setup to give you an excuse to go out and explore this giant world. And this is where the greatest strength of the game comes out to me, especially being how old it is this massive, expansive open world you get to just go walk around in and look for new towns. And as you continue to progress the game, you'll earn new ways of transportation. First you get a boat, and then you get a canoe that helps you traverse shallower water. After that, you'll be able to get the airship, which just completely opens up the rest of the world and lets you go anywhere you want. I found that the more I played the game and the more modes of transportation I acquired, the more fun I had traversing the world itself. The airship especially is when the game really clicked for me. It no longer felt tedious to go from place to place. I could go anywhere I wanted, explore any new side of the world that I wanted, at pretty much no cost. As someone who wasn't huge on the random encounters, the airship really helps cut those out, as you can just fly from place to place and pretty much avoid them entirely. On another note with the airship, I was actually just quite interested by its inclusion in the first place. I mean, having played 10 first, and you get the airship pretty much at the very end of that game, right when you're ready to go to the final boss. So I thought the airship was more of a newer thing in the Final Fantasy series. I knew it was in 7 because I had played that game as well, but I didn't realize that it was in literally the first game. That kind of was interesting to me. Especially since chocobos are actually absent in this game, which inversely I thought would have been a thing from the very start. It's just little things like this that made this game more enjoyable. You have to go in with that mentality of, I want to see where this series began. I want to see what ideas carried over from the very first title. And I think that's what made Final Fantasy I a somewhat enjoyable experience throughout my entire way through it, and accompanied by the fact that the game really just doesn't overstay its welcome. It's short, it's sweet, and it gets to the point quickly. This was not what I was expecting at all, as when I looked up how long this game would take to beat, the How Long to Beat website told me it would take about 17 hours to complete. I thought that would be an absolutely massive chunk of time to spend on a NES JRPG, But no, the 100% achievement on Steam only took me about 14 hours to obtain. Anyways, I think it's a good time to talk about the combat itself, since at the end of the day, this is probably what I was dreading the most. I've never been big on the turn-based random encounter JRPG classic combat system. I've always just found it kind of tedious. You run into an encounter every 5 seconds, you sit there, you input all your commands, it takes a good 5 minutes for the battle to finally end, and then you move on and it happens again in another 5 seconds, and that's why the game lasts 20 hours. Yeah, I'm not a fan if you can't tell. But this game does a fantastic job of remedying that in the best way that it possibly can with its auto battle feature. When you input an auto battle, it will just do all the commands that you had inputted last. So if you had all your characters set to attack and you press auto battle, they will just attack and it will fast forward everything until that is over. It speeds up the combat in this game just astronomically, and it made it so easy to just sit down and grind if I wanted to, even though I never had to. I was excited to get into these battles because they were snappy, they were quick, it wasn't annoying to get through. And this is a problem that I would even say I have with some of the newer Final Fantasy games that I played, if you could call them that, being 7 and 10. Both of those games, the encounters within them just take like 30 seconds a pop, and it's quite annoying to sit through. Whereas in these Pixel remasters, you just press that auto battle button and you're out in 5 seconds, and it's snappy, it's fun to watch, the death animation is satisfying, and it's nice. What's great is that the auto battle system doesn't just completely trivialize progression and battles in general. Yeah, you can use it to just get through the trash mobs, but when you find an encounter that's more challenging, you'll have to use your spells, or when you find a boss fight, you'll have to think more strategically. It's just that this auto battle system is great for a zoomer like me who has an extremely low attention span and wants to get to the next thing as quick as possible. So if you're anything like me and you were turned off by these older games, by their turn-based combat and potentially ancient difficulty design that just completely kills your enjoyment, well, honestly, don't worry. This game did a fantastic job. I think it's the remaster in particular did a fantastic job at ironing out those issues so that in modern day, the game really still feels enjoyable to sit through. That's not to say it's the best game I've ever played, and in a way, I wouldn't really recommend it to anyone who isn't already interested in Final Fantasy in some capacity. I think having played newer games actually made this far more enjoyable than it would have been without them. 14 in particular, because going and seeing the references that that game makes about these older games is so interesting to me. I feel like such a dumbass playing these old games and going, oh hey, that's from Final Fantasy XIV. Well, no, not really, but yeah. So, on the topic of battles and all that, let's talk about leveling, because I feel like when getting into an old JRPG like this is one of the first concerns, at least for me personally. How bad is the grinding? How much do I have to just sit around and kill enemies until I can move on with the story? And with this game, I am so happy to say none at all. The only time I ever had to grind in this game at all was for an achievement to kill every monster in the game, where there's a rare monster called War Mech at the end of the game that you just have to walk back and forth until he spawns, and it took me about 30 minutes because he's a pretty rare spawn rate. Other than that, literally no grinding. If you're just here to beat the game from start to finish, you can easily get through the game with no grinding at all, and because of the auto battle system, if you choose to grind, if you want to get a bit overpowered so that you're comfortably washing enemies, it's so easy to just sit down, turn on auto battle, throw on some music, and just get all those levels. I assume that most of these things were actually just fixed in the Pixel remaster and that the original still does suffer from problems of grinding and whatnot, but they did an amazing job at just ironing out all those problems. If you're looking to just sit down, play from start to finish, no grinding, no tedium, you could do it. This game's very straightforward. I'd even consider it probably the easiest Final Fantasy I've ever played. It's not that I found 7 or 10 particularly hard, but there are definitely boss fights in those games that I got stuck on for a bit, gave me, 2 or 3 attempts before I beat them. In this game, the only boss I ever died to was Chaos, and I beat him on my second attempt afterwards once I figured out how he worked. So if you're going into this game and you're worried about, are they just gonna, throw an enemy at me that afflicts me with every status effect in the game and then one-shots me, thankfully, you don't have to worry too much. The only run-in with difficulty that I had was actually in one of the first dungeons, called the Marsh Cave, I believe, in which I ran into the final boss of that area. It's just like these 4 basic enemies, which become basic enemies later in the game, basically. They wiped out everyone but one of my team members, and I had to find a way out of the dungeon with only one team member left, and it was a brutal experience because in this game, fleeing does not work consistently. If you get a preemptive strike, you can like flee pretty much every time, but in any other situation, it's just pure RNG if you flee or not. That is like one of my major complaints about this game, is that fleeing does not work consistently. Another positive I've alluded to mention so far is the quick save feature. This thing is an absolute godsend. You can just basically quick save at any point in the game, right before a boss, right after a boss, in the middle of a dungeon, whatever. Gone are the days of dying in a dungeon and having to go back to the very beginning. You're good. You can quick save whenever you want. You can load that save whenever you want. Yet another feature of this pixel remaster that makes this game so much more bearable to a zoomer like me. Now, I also think it would be a good time to mention the classes and the way the class system works in this game, because having played other Final Fantasies first, it was quite interesting. Essentially, when you start the game, you're given a choice between 6 different classes, which I did not know when I started this game, actually. I thought you had to pick Thief, Warrior, Black Mage, and White Mage. I thought those were the only options. But there's also a Red Mage and a Monk you can switch around, and I've heard that Monk is better than Thief, so you can do that, and maybe Red Mage is better than Black Mage in certain ways. But either way, I had no struggles going through with that basic set of 4. All of my characters felt great. My Thief at the beginning of the game felt a little underpowered, but once he went on to become a ninja, he ended up being an extremely valuable class. It's really interesting to see where these jobs started, especially having been a 14 player for a little while now. I played Black Mage and Red Mage, and they're in this game. They were 2 of the very first classes ever made. That's actually a big surprise to me, especially with the Red Mage and Ninja in particular. I would have thought those were more down-the-line ideas. Now let's talk about the dungeons in a bit more detail now, since I mentioned them a bit earlier but didn't really go into it. Dungeons in this game are pretty straightforward. You walk from place to place, you look for chests, you go to the end, you fight the boss, and you're done. It's that classic gameplay loop of Final Fantasy. It makes itself very clear to you in this game. You're going to go to towns, you stock up on items, you go into a dungeon, you fight the boss, you leave the dungeon, you stock up on items, you repeat. It's a simple yet fairly addictive gameplay loop. The dungeons themselves are made a lot more enjoyable by the fact that you actually have a mini-map to look at, and it'll show you where the chests in the dungeon are and where the stairs to the next floor will be. It just helps keep the pacing of this game really snappy and quick, which I think is its greatest strength, as I've been saying. Now lastly, I want to touch upon the music in this game, because lord, it is fantastic. I've not played the original, and I haven't heard the original soundtrack either, but this new rendition of it for the Pixel Remaster is some of the best Final Fantasy music I've even heard before, and I've played 7 and 10. Yeah, the soundtrack was seriously one of my favorite parts about playing this game, and the battle theme made going through all those random encounters so much more enjoyable. So there we have it, the Pixel Remaster of Final Fantasy I, and my messy and unorganized thoughts on it. If you're a zoomer and you're curious about the first Final Fantasy game, this is absolutely the best way you could possibly play it if you're looking to play it, and honestly, I don't recommend against it like I was expecting to after completing this game. I really did expect this to be an ancient, just hard game to get through, but no, this new Pixel Remaster made it, in a way, a blast to just play through. In fact, now that I know about Red Mage and Monk, I'm even interested in doing a second playthrough to try out those classes and see if I can do anything in a different order than I did on my first playthrough. So yeah, all in all, if you're interested in this game, I think it is absolutely worth dropping the $10 on the Pixel Remaster. That's probably the best way to play this game. I can't see any of the other versions being better than it for a newcomer to Final Fantasy 1. If this video helped inform you at all on the first Final Fantasy game, or if you enjoyed it, or if you liked anything I said, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell if you're interested to see my thoughts on future Final Fantasy titles, as I would like to make a video like this on Final Fantasy 2, since I'm playing through that right now, and likely just 1 through 6 in general, because I want to play all the Pixel remasters for those games and learn that part of JRPG history. Thanks for tuning in, Goats, and I'll catch you in the next one.